I invested $2 million in my son's new wellness resort business. When I finally called to ask about the grand opening, his wife casually replied that it had taken place 10 weeks ago. "We only invited close family and friends," she said. I was not considered close family. Days later, she had the nerve to call me again. "The payment is overdue," she snapped. "Have you transferred the money yet?" I paused. Then I smiled and said nothing. Before I continue this story, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who mistook your generosity for stupidity. My name is Nathaniel. I am 73 years old. I spent 40 years building a freight and logistics empire from the ground up on the freezing streets of Chicago. I started with one broken-down delivery truck. I ended up with a fleet of 218-wheelers moving cargo across the entire country. I dealt with cutthroat union bosses, corrupt politicians, and ruthless competitors. I know what it means to bleed for every dollar. I also know what it means to protect what is mine. When I sold my company 10 years ago, I did not announce it to the world. I quietly set up a private trust. I did not buy flashy cars or giant mansions. I lived quietly in a modest but comfortable home. My only son, Julian, however, grew up with everything I never had. After his mother, Vivian, passed away when he was just 10, I gave him the best education, the best opportunities, and unfortunately a soft life that made him weak. I spent my life building a fortress so he would never have to shiver in the cold, but I forgot to teach him how to fight the wolves. Julian married Chloe. Chloe came from a wealthy white family with a long lineage of country club memberships and a staggering sense of entitlement. Her father, Richard, liked to parade around as a real estate mogul. From the moment I met Chloe, she looked at me like I was the hired help. To her, I was just an old black man who somehow stumbled into a little bit of retirement money. She never understood that in my world you do not survive by accident. You survive by anticipating betrayal. You survive by reading the fine print that everyone else ignores. A year ago, Julian came to me with a business proposal. He and Chloe wanted to open a luxury wellness resort just outside the city. It was supposed to be an exclusive retreat for the ultra-rich. Julian begged me for the seed money. He said Chloe's father, Richard, was bringing in his own construction firm to handle the build, but they needed $2 million in liquid cash to secure the property and begin renovations. I looked at the business plan. It was sloppy, but Julian was my son. I wanted to see him succeed. I wanted him to build his own table, so I gave him the $2 million. For months, I heard nothing. Whenever I called Julian, he was always too busy to talk. He would say they were overwhelmed with permits and construction delays. I gave them space. I am not a man who hovers. I respect the hustle if the hustle is real. But last Tuesday, I decided I had waited long enough. I sat in my leather armchair, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and dialed my son's number. It rang 4 times before it went to voicemail. I called back. This time, Chloe picked up. "Hello, Nathaniel," she answered. She never called me Dad or Mr. Nathaniel. Just Nathaniel, like I was the gardener. I asked her how the resort was coming along. I told her I wanted to know the date of the grand opening so I could book a flight and make arrangements to be there. I even bought a new custom suit for the occasion. Chloe let out a short, annoyed sigh. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with careless disregard. "The grand opening was 10 weeks ago, Nathaniel. We had a soft launch in early October." I sat perfectly still. The coffee in my mug suddenly stopped giving off steam. 10 weeks ago. I processed the words slowly. I asked her why I was not informed, why the man who funded the entire foundation of their dream was not standing there to cut the ribbon. "Well, Nathaniel, it was a very exclusive event," Chloe said without a hint of shame. "We wanted to keep the guest list highly curated. We only invited close family and friends, you know how it is. We had to impress the local investors and my father's business partners. We just did not think it was your kind of scene, Nathaniel. It was a very sophisticated crowd. We did not want you to feel out of place." Out of place. I built the very floor she was standing on, but she decided I was not sophisticated enough to walk on it. I was the father of the groom. I was the primary financial backer. But to Chloe and her aristocratic circle, I was a ghost. I was a wallet with no face. They gladly took my $2 million, but they were too embarrassed to have an old black man from Chicago standing in their pristine white lobby. A lesser man would have yelled. A weaker man would have demanded an apology or cried about disrespect. I did neither. Anger is a useless emotion. Anger makes you loud, and loud people are easy to defeat. I prefer the silence. Silence makes your enemies comfortable. It makes them careless. I simply breathed in and replied, "I understand, Chloe. Congratulations on the launch." Then I hung up the phone. I did not call Julian to complain. I did not text them angry messages. I sat in my silent house and let the absolute clarity of the situation wash over me. Julian had made his choice. He had allowed his wife to disrespect his father. He had traded his bloodline for a seat at a table that would never truly respect him. They thought I was just a naive old man who handed over a fortune and forgot about it. They thought the transaction was over. They thought they held all the leverage because the building was already standing. They were very wrong. Exactly 4 days later, my phone rang again. It was Chloe. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. "Nathaniel, we have a problem," she said immediately. No greeting, no small talk. "What is the problem, Chloe?" I asked calmly. "The third quarter payment is overdue," she snapped. Her tone was sharp and commanding. "My father Richard has construction crews threatening to walk off the site. We need the next installment of $500,000 transferred today. We sent you the email reminder last week. Have you transferred the money yet? You are putting our entire operation at risk, Nathaniel. You need to call your bank immediately." I listened to the shrill panic in her voice. I pictured her standing in her luxurious resort barking orders at the man who bought the ground she was standing on. She actually believed she held the power. She believed my money was her birthright. I paused. I let the silence stretch over the phone line for 10 agonizing seconds. I could hear her breathing getting heavier. "Nathaniel, are you there?" she demanded. "Yes, Chloe." "I am here," I said softly. A cold smile spread across my face. A smile she could not see, but I am sure she could feel. "Then transfer the funds," she insisted. I did not say another word. I pressed the red button and ended the call. I placed the phone face down on my desk. I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted portal to my private wealth management firm. I looked at the pending transfer of $500,000 scheduled for tomorrow. It was supposed to be the final injection of capital for their operational costs. I did not hesitate. I dialed the direct number to Marcus, my senior wealth manager. He picked up on the first ring. "Good morning, Mr. Nathaniel," Marcus said. "Good morning, Marcus," I replied. "I need you to execute an immediate stop on all scheduled transfers to Julian and Chloe's business accounts. Freeze the outbound ledger entirely. Not a single cent leaves my trust." "Consider it done, sir," Marcus replied smoothly. "Is there anything else?" "Yes," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Pull up the original contract they signed for the $2 million. Have our legal team review the default clauses. We are going to need them very soon." I ended the call with Marcus. The room was quiet again. The ATM was officially closed. Chloe and Julian thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they could take my money, lock me out of the castle, and continue to drain my accounts from the outside. They did not realize that the old man from Chicago never gives away his money for free. Every dollar I gave them came with a very specific legal string attached, and I was about to pull it tight enough to choke their entire empire. They wanted to play high-stakes games with my money. I was going to teach them exactly what happens when you sit down at a table with a man who owns the casino. The sound of squealing tires tore through the quiet morning air of my suburban neighborhood. It was the distinct sound of European engineering being driven by an amateur in a panic. I did not need to look out the window to know my son Julian had arrived. He was driving the imported sports car he bought with the so-called management fees from his new business. I remained seated in my worn leather chair in the corner of my study. This was the same chair where I had negotiated union contracts and destroyed rival trucking companies decades ago. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. It was still hot. The front door flew open. Julian did not bother to knock. He stormed down the hallway and burst into my study like a wild animal. His face was flushed red with anger, and his expensive tailored suit looked uncharacteristically rumpled and ruined. For the first time in his life, my son looked like a frightened boy wearing clothes that were far too big for him. He pointed a shaking finger at me across the room. "What in the world did you do?" he shouted. "My phone has been ringing off the hook all morning. The bank manager called to tell me you put a hard freeze on the outbound wire transfer. Chloe is having a complete breakdown in the living room, and Richard is threatening to pull his entire construction crew off the western wing of the property. Are you out of your mind, old man?" I did not raise my voice. I did not even set my coffee mug down. I simply looked at the boy I had raised, the boy I had shielded from the bitter freezing winters of Chicago and the ruthless men who ran the freight docks. I had protected him from the ugly side of the world so completely that he grew up believing the world was inherently fair. I made a secure financial fortress for him, but I never taught him how to spot an enemy who smiles warmly. The payment was halted, I said, my voice perfectly level. There is a severe discrepancy in your timeline, Julian. Your wife informed me yesterday that the resort had its grand opening 10 weeks ago. Yet here you are standing in my house demanding $500,000 in operational capital to finish a construction wing. Which one is it? Julian paced back and forth across my Persian rug. He threw his hands up in the air, groaning in frustration as if dealing with a stubborn child. You do not understand how these things work, he said, dripping with the exact same condescension his wife used. It was a soft launch, a highly exclusive preview strictly for high-net-worth individuals. Richard structured the opening that way to maximize early capital while the final sector of the property was being completed. It is a very common strategy in luxury commercial real estate. But that is not something you would know anything about. I let that insult hang in the heavy air of the study. Not something I would know anything about. I spent 40 years moving thousands of tons of freight across the United States. I negotiated multi-million-dollar logistics contracts with vicious men who would break your jaw in an alleyway if you misplaced a decimal point. I built a tangible empire out of blood, sweat, and diesel fuel, while this Richard character likely inherited his entire portfolio from his grandfather. But to my only son, I was just an ignorant old black man who knew absolutely nothing about the sophisticated and complex world of white aristocratic business. Richard has bent over backwards to make this project happen, Julian continued, pacing faster now. He is using his own commercial construction firm to build the resort at cost. Do you have any idea how much money he is saving us? He is an absolute business genius. He has political connections and zoning board relationships that you could not even dream of. And now you are humiliating me in front of him. You are making me look like an incompetent fool who cannot even manage his own silent investor. Silent investor. That was all I was to him now. Not a father, just a source of funds who was misbehaving. I watched my son defend the very man who was actively robbing him blind. Julian was so desperate for Richard's validation and approval. He was so desperate to be accepted into Chloe's elite social circle that he was completely willing to scream at the man who gave him life. He was aggressively defending the wolf while snapping at the guard dog. Julian did not understand that real wealth is not about wearing expensive suits or hosting glamorous parties with local politicians. Real wealth is about control. I learned that on the docks of Chicago when men tried to burn my delivery trucks to the ground to eliminate the competition. I did not fight them with my fists. I bought the land their trucks were parked on and evicted them legally. I learned to destroy my enemies on paper. Richard Sterling was playing a very old and very predictable game. He was overbilling a captive client using his own subsidiary companies to funnel the capital back into his personal accounts. It was a classic embezzlement scheme wrapped up neatly in the shiny packaging of a family business venture. But Julian was too blinded by the luxury to see the trap closing around his own neck. If you do not call your wealth manager right now and authorize that wire transfer, Richard is going to walk, Julian warned, stepping closer to my desk. And if he walks, the entire project stalls. We will be in breach of contract with our premium vendors. Chloe has already started talking about equity restructuring if I cannot pull my weight financially. Do you understand what that means? It means they will push me out of my own company. He was so close to the truth, yet completely blind to it. They were not going to push him out. They had already pushed him out. They were simply waiting for my bank accounts to run completely dry before making his termination official. They had used him to get to my vault, and now that they had the codes, they were preparing to dispose of the middleman. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden desk. I looked up at my only son. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake the ignorance right out of him. I wanted to slap him across the face to wake him up from this pathetic delusion. But a master chess player never wins his matches by flipping the wooden board over in anger. He wins by letting his opponent confidently make the wrong move. "Go home, Julian," I said, my tone completely devoid of emotion. What he asked, taking a confused step backward. I said, "Go home," I repeated. "Go back to your wife. Go back to your father-in-law. Tell them I am a stubborn old fool who needs a few days to figure out how to use the banking application. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to save face. But get out of my house right now." Julian stared at me, his chest heaving. He had expected a massive argument. He had expected me to yell back or perhaps cave to his demands. My absolute cold and calculated silence terrified him much more than any violent threat I could have made. "You are ruining my life," he hissed, turning toward the door. I swear to God, if I lose this company because of your petty, massive ego, I will never, ever speak to you again." He slammed the door so hard the framed photographs on the wall rattled. One of those pictures was of Julian when he was 12 years old holding a first-place trophy from a science fair. I stared at that picture for a long time. Then I reached for my phone. I dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. It was the direct line to Desmond. Desmond was not a standard corporate banker or a typical corporate defense lawyer. He was a forensic accountant. We worked together back in Chicago when I needed to audit a rival transport company before executing a hostile takeover. Desmond had a mind like a steel trap and the flexible morality of a starving ocean shark. He did not care about feelings. He only cared about numbers and finding where the bodies were buried. The line clicked open. Desmond, speaking a gravelly voice, answered. "Desmond, it is Nathaniel," I said. "Nathaniel," he chuckled warmly. "I thought you retired to play golf and sit on the porch down in Atlanta. What do you need?" "An audit of your country club membership fees." "I need a bloodhound, Desmond," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "I have a $2 million investment trapped inside a luxury wellness resort project. The operating company is managed by my son and his wife. The primary construction contractor is the wife's father. I need you to rip their financial books wide open. I want to know exactly where every single penny of my money went. I want construction invoices, fabricated payroll records, shell companies' offshore accounts, and every single hidden vendor contract. I want everything." There was a brief pause on the line. I could hear the sound of Desmond typing rapidly on a mechanical keyboard. "Who is the father-in-law?" he asked. "Richard Sterling," I replied. "He runs a commercial construction firm right here in the state." "Sterling," Desmond muttered to himself. "Give me 48 hours, Nathaniel. If this guy used your money to buy a single pack of chewing gum, I will find the receipt for it. Do not let anyone know you are looking, Desmond. No bank alerts, no state registry pings. Be a ghost. Always my friend. I will call you when I find the corpse." He hung up the phone. I sat alone in the quiet house. Julian accused me of ruining his life. He did not realize I was the only thing standing between him and absolute financial destruction. Richard and Chloe thought they were playing a numbers game with a foolish old man. They thought I was an easy mark who would blindly sign checks just to buy their fake affection. They did not know I spoke the language of numbers more fluently than they could ever hope to comprehend. I built my empire by hunting predators much larger and much smarter than Richard Sterling. The audit had officially begun, and when the truth came out, I was going to burn their fake aristocratic world straight to the ground. The waiting is always the hardest part for amateurs. They pace around the room. They chew their fingernails. They let anxiety eat away at their discipline. But I am not an amateur. I spent my younger years running logistics in Chicago. When you manage a fleet of 200 freight trucks moving across the Midwest, you learn how to wait. I remember a winter in 1982 when a rival outfit tried to hijack 3 of my trucks carrying high-value electronics. They thought they could just swallow my cargo and disappear into the snow. They did not know that I had already installed early tracking devices hidden deep inside the chassis of every single vehicle I owned. I did not call the police right away. I sat in my freezing office and watched the blinking red dots on a monitor. I waited for them to lead me all the way back to their central distribution hub. Then I took everything they had. Patience is not just a virtue. Patience is a weapon. It is the quiet act of letting your enemy dig a hole deep enough that they can never climb out of it. I spent the next 2 days tending to my garden. I pruned the rose bushes my late wife Vivian planted. I watered the hydrangeas. I drank my black coffee on the back porch and listened to the birds. I did not look at my phone. I knew Desmond would call when he had the corpse. That is what we always called the undeniable proof of financial treason. The corpse. On the 3rd morning, my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I picked it up. Desmond did not say hello. He just told me to check my secure email server. He said I was going to want to sit down for this one. I took my coffee into the study and booted up my laptop. I opened the encrypted file Desmond had sent. It was a 90-page forensic audit. The numbers were laid out with surgical precision. I read through the summary report first. Desmond was a master at his craft. He had peeled back the layers of Richard Sterling and his so-called commercial construction empire. It turned out that the empire was nothing more than a crumbling shack built on decades of bad debt and failed projects. Richard was not a wealthy aristocrat. He was a desperate man drowning in a sea of unpaid loans and tax liens. His construction firm had not landed a major commercial contract in over 4 years. He was surviving on the fading reputation of his grandfather and the illusion of high society wealth. He drove leased cars. He remortgaged his country estate twice. He was on the verge of total bankruptcy when my son Julian brought him the perfect lifeline. That lifeline was me. I scrolled down to the itemized ledger. Desmond had tracked every single dollar of the $2 million I transferred to the wellness resort project. Richard had set himself up as the primary general contractor. This meant he controlled the flow of all incoming capital. He was supposed to use my money to hire subcontractors, buy premium materials, and secure the necessary permits. Instead, he used my money as his own personal bailout fund. The method was painfully simple but effective enough to fool a novice like Julian. Richard created a series of phantom vendor accounts under the umbrella of his construction firm. He invoiced the wellness resort for luxury imported Italian marble, but he actually purchased cheap ceramic tiles from a liquidator. He billed the resort for high-end commercial plumbing systems, but he installed standard residential pipes using unlicensed day laborers. He charged my son a 50% markup on every single nail piece of wood and gallon of paint used on the property. But the overbilling was only the beginning of the theft. Desmond found the real bleeding in the consulting fees. Richard had established 3 separate shell companies registered in Delaware. These companies provided absolutely zero services. They existed only on paper. Yet every month, Richard authorized massive payments from the Wellness Resort Operating Fund to these phantom companies for things like environmental impact studies, aesthetic design consulting, and logistical management. The invoices were rubber-stamped by Chloe, who was officially listed as the financial director of the resort. My own daughter-in-law was authorizing the theft of my money to save her father's sinking ship. I looked at the final tally at the bottom of the screen. Of the $2 million I had provided, only $600,000 had actually gone into the construction of the building. The remaining $1,400,000 had been systematically siphoned out. Desmond tracked those stolen funds straight through the Delaware shell companies and directly into Richard's personal bank accounts. Richard used my money to pay off his back taxes. He used my money to settle a pending lawsuit from a previous client he had defrauded. He even used $50,000 of my money to buy Chloe a brand new luxury vehicle for her birthday. They had thrown a lavish grand opening party 10 weeks ago using my money to buy the expensive champagne they drank while they laughed at the ignorant old black man who made it all possible. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The sheer arrogance of it all was breathtaking. They did not just steal from me. They treated me like an endless well of stupid money. They thought because I did not come from their world of country clubs and inherited trust funds that I would not understand how to read a balance sheet. They assumed my wealth was a fluke. They assumed I was blind. The most painful part of the revelation was not the money. I could lose $2 million and still sleep soundly. The most painful part was seeing Julian's signature on the quarterly approval documents. He had signed off on the inflated budgets. He had signed off on the phantom consulting fees. I had to ask myself if my son was an active participant in this criminal conspiracy or if he was simply a useful idiot blinded by love and a desperate need to fit in. I reviewed the timestamps on his signatures. They were all executed digitally, often late at night or early in the morning. Julian was never good with numbers. He hated accounting in college. He always signed whatever paperwork was put in front of him if it meant he could get back to the creative side of the business. Chloe and Richard knew this. They weaponized his trust. They weaponized his laziness. They turned my son into an unwitting accomplice in the robbery of his own inheritance. My phone vibrated. It was a text message from Desmond. He asked what my next move would be. He had enough evidence to send Richard to federal prison by tomorrow morning. I typed my reply very slowly. I told him to hold the documents. Sending them to jail from a distance was far too merciful. I needed to watch them burn. I did not want to rely entirely on spreadsheets and forensic audits. I needed to see the theft with my own 2 eyes. The next afternoon, I drove my 10-year-old pickup truck out to the rolling hills just outside the city limits. The entrance to the wellness resort was marked by massive iron gates and a pristine guardhouse. I did not give the uniformed guard my real name. I simply told him I was a delivery driver dropping off some important legal documents for the financial director. He barely looked at my face before lifting the heavy security barrier. That was their very first mistake. Security is always an illusion when you do not respect the people you think are beneath you. I drove up the long, winding driveway lined with imported palm trees that had absolutely no business growing in this harsh climate. I parked my battered truck right next to a long row of sleek European sports cars. I stepped out and looked at the magnificent main building. It was a sprawling estate of glass and stone built entirely on the back of my stolen wealth. I walked through the massive double doors into the main lobby. The air inside smelled of lavender and expensive cedar wood. I looked down at the floor. Desmond's detailed audit had specifically mentioned imported Italian marble, but my experienced eyes told a completely different story. I had handled shipping manifests for commercial construction companies for over 4 decades. I knew the exact difference between authentic heavy stone and high-grade ceramic tiles. Richard had charged my son for a royal palace, but he built a cheap movie set. I walked past the reception desk. The young woman behind the marble counter gave me a highly confused look. I was wearing my old leather work boots, faded denim jeans, and a plain gray wool sweater. In a room full of people wearing expensive designer activewear and flashing diamond tennis bracelets, I stood out like a stray dog at an elite dog show. I did not care. I belonged there more than anyone else in that entire building. I owned the very ground they were standing on. I walked toward the open-air terrace where a country club-style brunch was taking place under the bright afternoon sun. That was where I finally found my daughter-in-law. Chloe was sitting at a large circular table surrounded by 4 other women. They were all dressed in pristine white linen outfits, drinking expensive mimosas out of tall crystal flutes. They were laughing loudly, their shrill voices echoing across the manicured green lawn. Chloe looked exactly like a queen holding court. She was wearing a heavy diamond necklace that I knew for a fact was purchased with the funds meant for the commercial plumbing system. I stood near the edge of the stone terrace, simply watching her. I wanted to see exactly how she operated in her natural environment. She was loudly bragging about the new resort, talking about how utterly exhausting it was to manage such a massive and complex undertaking. She claimed she single-handedly designed the entire wellness program and curated the organic menu. I felt a deep and heavy sense of pity for my son. Julian had traded his soul and his family legacy for a woman who would gladly sell him out for a weekend spa trip. Then one of her wealthy friends noticed me standing there. She leaned over and whispered something into Chloe's ear, pointing discreetly in my direction. Chloe turned around abruptly. Her bright, fake smile instantly vanished. The fake warmth in her eyes was entirely replaced by cold, hard contempt. She stood up from the table and marched aggressively over to me. She did not bother to pull me aside for a quiet, private conversation. She wanted an audience. She wanted to show her wealthy, aristocratic friends exactly how she handled the hired help. "What are you doing here, Nathaniel?" she demanded, her voice loud enough for all the neighboring tables to clearly hear. "You cannot just wander onto the property uninvited. This is a private club for our exclusive members." I looked calmly at her flushed face. "I wanted to see the grand opening," I said mildly. "Since I missed the first one 10 weeks ago, I thought I would come down and see what my $2 million actually bought. I see it bought a lot of expensive champagne and very cheap ceramic floor tiles." Chloe's face turned a dark, angry shade of red. Her friends were watching her every single move with wide eyes. She stepped much closer to me, aggressively invading my personal space. "Do not embarrass yourself, Nathaniel," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You are entirely out of your element here. You look like a homeless vagrant. You are scaring my high-paying clients. I need you to leave my property right now. But before you go, you need to sign the final capital release authorization." She snapped her fingers loudly, and a young, nervous assistant scurried over, handing her a thick leather folder. Chloe forcefully shoved the folder right into my chest. "Sign the papers, Nathaniel," she ordered. "Stop being such a stubborn old fool. Julian told me you are just confused about how to use the banking application. Stop playing these pathetic games and sign the release so my father can finish his important job. If you do not sign this paperwork today, we are going to have our elite corporate lawyers look deeply into your mental competency. You are clearly becoming senile and paranoid." The threat was not subtle in the slightest. She was publicly threatening to declare me mentally unfit simply because I stopped funding her extravagant stolen lifestyle. Her friends were openly staring at us now, whispering fiercely behind their manicured hands. They looked at me with a sickening mixture of pure amusement and deep disgust. They saw a frail old black man being firmly put in his place by a powerful and wealthy young executive. They did not see the silent executioner standing right before them. I slowly took the heavy leather folder from her hands. I opened it and carefully looked at the legal release papers. It was a formal demand for the remaining $500,000 of my money. I looked back up at Chloe. She was smiling a very smug and completely triumphant smirk. She really believed she had won the war. She truly believed she had humiliated me into complete submission in front of her peers. I quietly closed the folder. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a dramatic scene. I simply handed the folder back to her. "I am not going to sign this, Chloe," I said quietly, so only she could hear my words. "I am going to let you and your father keep the fake ceramic tiles and the fabricated consulting fees, but I highly suggest you enjoy your expensive mimosa today, because the massive bill for this little luxury party is coming due very soon." I turned my back on her before she could even process my response or utter another single word. I walked slowly across the wide stone terrace, feeling the judgmental eyes of every wealthy patron burning a deep hole into my back. I walked right past the fake marble floors and straight out the massive double doors of the lobby. I got back into my 10-year-old pickup truck and started the heavy diesel engine. I had seen more than enough of their pathetic illusion today. The steel trap was now completely set. Chloe had blindly stepped into it, and she did not know the jaws were about to snap tightly shut forever. I waited for the retaliation. When you cut off the oxygen to a fire, it does not just quietly burn out right away. It gasps and flares up, trying to consume anything within its reach to stay alive. Richard and Chloe were suffocating. They needed my money to keep their fake empire afloat, and I had firmly locked the vault. I knew they would not just walk away. Parasites never let go of the host voluntarily. You have to rip them off. I expected angry phone calls. I expected Julian to come back to my house begging or screaming. But the house remained completely silent for 3 entire days. It was the kind of heavy silence that usually precedes a devastating storm. On Thursday morning, the storm finally arrived. It did not come with shouting or violence. It came in a thick manila envelope delivered by a process server who knocked loudly on my front door. I signed for the package and carried it into my study. I sat down in my leather chair and sliced the envelope open with a brass letter opener. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The seal of the state court was stamped on the very first page. I put on my reading glasses and began to read. I have read thousands of legal contracts in my life. I have read hostile takeover bids, union demands, and bankruptcy filings. But I had never read anything quite as bold and repulsive as the document I was holding in my hands. It was a formal petition for an emergency conservatorship. Chloe and Richard were not just suing me for breach of contract regarding the remaining funds. That would have been a standard business dispute. But a standard lawsuit takes months or years, and they did not have that kind of time. They needed cash immediately, so they chose the nuclear option. They were officially petitioning the court to strip me of my legal autonomy. They wanted the judge to declare me mentally incompetent to manage my own financial affairs. I read through the sworn affidavits attached to the petition. The sheer level of fabrication was almost impressive. Chloe had submitted a sworn statement claiming that I was exhibiting severe signs of advanced dementia. She wrote that my decision to freeze the business capital was not a calculated financial move, but a sudden bout of elderly paranoia. She claimed I was suffering from delusions of theft and persecution. She painted a picture of a confused and aggressive old black man who was actively destroying his own family because his aging brain could no longer process reality. There was another affidavit from a private psychiatrist whom I had never even met in my entire life. This doctor claimed he had reviewed my behavioral history through extensive consultations with my family. He concluded that my sudden withdrawal from public events like missing the grand opening of the resort and my hostile behavior at the country club were clear clinical indicators of cognitive decline. They had taken my calculated silence and weaponized it against me. They took my refusal to play their aristocratic games and diagnosed it as mental illness. The final page of the petition was the most revealing. If the judge granted the emergency conservatorship, all of my assets would be placed under the legal control of a designated guardian, and the name of the proposed guardian was Richard Sterling. They were not just trying to steal the remaining $500,000, they were trying to swallow my entire estate. My house, my private trusts, my offshore holdings, and every single dollar I had bled for on the streets of Chicago. They wanted to lock me in a nursing home and feast on my life work. But the true heartbreak was not the greed of Richard or the malicious lies of Chloe. I had expected them to act exactly like the predators they were. The true heartbreak was found on the second page of the filing. There, right beneath Chloe's signature, was the signature of my only son. Julian had signed the petition. He had officially endorsed the lie that his own father was losing his mind. He had agreed to hand over the keys to my kingdom to the very people who were robbing him blind. I stared at Julian's signature for a very long time. I remembered teaching him how to write his name when he was a little boy sitting right at this very desk. I remembered holding his small hand and guiding the pen. Now he had used that same signature to sign my life away. I realized in that quiet moment that my son was truly gone. The boy I had raised was dead. He had been completely consumed by his desperation to belong to Chloe's world. He was too weak to face his own failures, so he chose to believe their lies. He chose to believe that his father was crazy rather than admit that his father was right. A lesser man would have broken down. A lesser man would have felt fear. The prospect of losing your freedom and your mind in the eyes of the law is a terrifying thing. The legal system is incredibly cruel to the elderly. Once a judge labels you incompetent, it is nearly impossible to prove otherwise. You become a prisoner in your own body, and your wealth becomes the property of your wardens. Richard and Chloe knew exactly how the system worked. They knew that courts often favor the younger, more articulate white family members over the elderly black patriarch. They thought they had found the perfect legal weapon to neutralize me permanently. I put the documents down on my desk. I took a deep breath. I did not feel fear. I did not feel sadness anymore. I only felt a cold, metallic resolve settling deep into my bones. This was no longer just a lesson about financial responsibility. This was a war for my survival. They had decided to cross the final line. They wanted to take my mind and my dignity. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for Marcus, my senior wealth manager. He answered immediately. I told him to contact the elite corporate litigators we kept on retainer. I did not want the standard family lawyers. I wanted the vicious corporate sharks who dismantled companies for sport. I wanted the men who charged $1,000 an hour to burn their opponents to the ground. I instructed Marcus to forward the entire forensic audit that Desmond had compiled straight to the legal team. The audit proved that I was not paranoid. The audit proved that my suspicions of theft were entirely factual and mathematically sound. Freezing the accounts was not an act of dementia. It was an act of extreme financial clarity. They thought they had built a brilliant legal trap. They thought they had successfully backed the old bear into a dark corner where he could never fight back. They gladly handed me the very rope they planned to hang me with. I was simply going to tie it into a very tight noose. The greatest weapon in any war is the illusion of your own defeat. I sat in my quiet study and looked at the drafted conservatorship papers resting on my oak desk. Richard and Chloe had played their final card. They expected me to fight back with anger or panic. They expected me to hire family lawyers and drag this ugly dispute through the crowded public courts. But a man who has built an empire from the frozen streets of Chicago does not panic. He simply adjusts the board. I picked up my cell phone and slowly dialed my son's number. Julian answered on the second ring. His voice was thick with defensive tension. He asked what I wanted. I did not raise my voice. I injected a heavy dose of fabricated exhaustion into my tone. I told him he had won. I told him I was too old and too tired to fight my own family in a courtroom. I said my heart could not take the stress of a public legal battle. I asked him to call off the lawyers and the psychiatrists. I promised I would sign the remaining business capital over and step down completely right now. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Julian was genuinely surprised, but his relief was instantly palpable. He quickly tried to mask his joy with a tone of fake sympathy. He told me it was for the best. He said I was making the right choice for my health and for the legacy of the family. He promised that he and Chloe would take excellent care of the wellness resort. He actually believed he was the architect of my surrender. He had no idea he was walking into an open grave tomorrow morning. I told Julian to arrange a formal board meeting for Friday morning. I said I wanted to hand over the reins officially in front of Richard and the other executives. I wanted everything documented properly so I could finally retire in absolute peace. Julian eagerly agreed. He said he would have Chloe draft the final release papers immediately. We ended the call. I placed the phone gently on my desk and allowed myself a single cold smile. The hook was set. Now I just needed to let them pull the heavy line, thinking they had caught a massive blind whale. To understand the trap, you must understand the financial architecture of my investment. I did not simply write a personal check to my son. I routed the $2 million through a shadow holding company I owned called Apex Horizon. On paper, Apex Horizon is a faceless corporate entity managed by aggressive attorneys. Richard and Chloe never bothered to look past the first layer of paperwork. They saw my money and grabbed it blindly. They did not realize Apex Horizon held a senior loan over their resort operation. This loan meant that I did not just own a minor percentage of their business. It meant I owned the debt that controlled their entire financial existence. If they failed to make a scheduled payment, my holding company had the legal right to seize all of their operational assets. Chloe had already admitted on our recorded phone call that they were late on their third quarter payment. She essentially confessed to defaulting on the loan. They thought they were pushing a helpless old man out of the picture. They did not realize they were handing me the executioner's heavy axe. Later that evening, my private investigator sent me a digital copy of an internal email from Chloe. The moment Julian told her about my surrender, she went into an absolute frenzy of arrogant celebration. She immediately contacted a major public relations firm. She drafted a massive press release announcing that the wellness resort had successfully secured full independent capital control. She planned to send the press release to every major lifestyle magazine and business journal in the city on Friday afternoon. She wanted the entire world to know that she and Richard were the sole supreme rulers of the resort. Richard was equally blinded by his own toxic greed. He used his personal credit cards to book a private VIP table at the most expensive steakhouse in the city for Friday night. He invited his wealthy country club friends and his shady business partners to celebrate what he called the ultimate acquisition. They were already spending the $500,000 they assumed I was going to hand over to them. They were drinking expensive champagne and laughing at the stupid old man who gave up his fortune because he was too scared to face them in a legal courtroom. I spent Thursday afternoon preparing for the meeting. I did not wear my old leather boots or my faded denim jeans. I went into my closet and pulled out a bespoke charcoal gray suit. It was the exact same suit I wore 10 years ago when I sold my logistics empire for a massive fortune. I polished my black Oxford shoes until they shined like dark mirrors. I selected a subtle silk tie. If you are going to attend a corporate execution, you must always dress appropriately for the bloody occasion. Vivian always told me to look sharp and dangerous. I stood in front of the bedroom mirror and adjusted my cuffs. I looked at the reflection of the old man staring back at me. My hair was entirely silver, and there were deep lines etched around my eyes. But the fire inside was still burning incredibly hot. It was the same fire that kept me alive when I was starving in Chicago. Chloe and Richard looked at my silver hair and saw a weak and confused victim. They confused my deliberate silence with pure ignorance. They mistook my patience for cowardice. They were about to learn a terrible lesson. I packed my leather briefcase with surgical precision. I included the forensic audit prepared by Desmond showing every stolen dollar Richard funneled into his personal accounts. I included the original loan documents proving that Apex Horizon held the senior debt. I also included a formal notice of immediate foreclosure. The paperwork was devastatingly complete. There were no loopholes and no escape routes. I snapped the brass locks of the briefcase shut. The sound echoed loudly in the empty room like a prison door slamming shut. My son had chosen his side. Now he would have to face the brutal consequences. The night before the meeting, I slept incredibly well. I did not toss and turn with anxiety or guilt. When you know you are completely right, the mind finds an absolute state of peace. I woke up before the sun rose. I brewed my black coffee and sat on the porch watching the morning mist roll over the grass. I thought about the sheer arrogance of people who believe they can steal without paying the ultimate price. I finished my coffee and picked up my keys. The trap was perfectly set. It was finally time to spring the steel jaws. The morning sun reflected blindly off the massive glass windows of the wellness resort. I parked my pickup truck in the very back of the parking lot. I stepped out and adjusted my charcoal gray suit. I felt the comforting weight of the leather briefcase in my left hand. Today was a day for absolute surgical precision. I walked slowly toward the main entrance. I had spent 40 years building wealth from nothing in Chicago. I knew exactly how fragile an empire could be when built on lies. Richard and Chloe were about to learn that brutal lesson today. Inside the main lobby, the air smelled of expensive eucalyptus and false success. I bypassed the front desk and made my way toward the executive suites. I could hear loud laughter echoing down the long marble hallway. It was the arrogant laughter of people who thought they won the war. I stopped just outside the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. I stood still and listened to the vultures fighting over the fresh carcass. Richard was loudly holding court inside. He was talking about expansion plans and securing new commercial loans. I heard Chloe chime in, agreeing with her father. Julian was also in the room, but he was completely silent. I turned the brass handle and stepped slowly into the massive room. Richard was sitting comfortably at the head of the mahogany conference table. He was leaning back in his leather chair, swirling dark coffee. Chloe was sitting directly to his right. She had a thick stack of legal documents resting on the table. They were the vicious conservatorship papers ready to be filed with the court. Julian was sitting on the far side looking down at his empty hands. The room fell into an immediate dead silence when they saw my face. "Good morning, Nathaniel," Richard said, a smug smile spreading across his wrinkled face. "We were beginning to think you were not going to show up today. Please take a seat right now so we can get this over quickly." I did not sit down. I stood silently at the opposite end of the table and looked directly at him. Richard thought his cheap construction scams made him invincible. Chloe eagerly tapped her manicured fingers on top of the conservatorship papers. "We have the legal documents prepared for your signature, Nathaniel," she said sweetly. "This is absolutely the best decision for everyone involved. Julian fully agrees that your declining health needs to be our primary focus. Once you sign the capital release authorization, we will withdraw this medical petition. You can simply go home and rest peacefully." It was blatant criminal extortion. They were actively holding my personal freedom hostage in exchange for my money. But I did not come to this meeting alone. I stepped aside and left the heavy wooden doorway wide open. 3 imposing men walked confidently into the boardroom right behind me. They were absolute corporate assassins. The first man was Marcus, my trusted senior wealth manager. The second man was David, a ruthless corporate litigator who dismantled fraudulent companies. The third man was someone Richard and Chloe had never seen before. He was the official senior legal representative of Apex Horizon. The smug smile on Richard's face instantly vanished without a trace. He sat forward in his leather chair, staring at the 3 strange men. Chloe's hands slowly moved away from her cruel extortion papers. The heavy atmosphere shifted from arrogant celebration to sudden icy confusion. "Who exactly are these people?" Richard demanded, loudly, losing his confident, booming quality. "This is a private, closed-door executive board meeting. You have no legal right to bring outside counsel into this room." I finally pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down calmly. I placed my leather briefcase firmly on the polished mahogany wood. "These men are not outside counsel, Richard," I said incredibly calmly. "They are the actual legitimate owners of this room. We are not here to sign your pathetic release papers today. We are here to conduct a formal criminal audit of your financial mismanagement." Chloe jumped up from her leather chair, her face flushed with hot anger. "You cannot do this!" "Nathaniel," she yelled, pointing a violently shaking finger at me, "Julian is the chief executive officer of this entire company. If you do not sign these legal papers, we are going to a judge. We will quickly have you legally declared mentally incompetent by noon today." Julian finally looked up from his shaking hands. His face was pale and covered in cold, nervous sweat. "Dad, please," he whispered, his voice trembling heavily. "Just sign the papers now. They are going to take your house, Dad." I looked at my only son with profound sadness and absolute cold resolve. I was not angry at him anymore. I just felt sorry for his weakness. "Julian," I said, my voice incredibly steady and low, "I spent my life building a strong table so you would have a safe place to eat. But you invited ruthless thieves to dinner and let them steal the plates. I am definitely not going to let it go. I am going to completely break the table." I reached out and clicked the brass locks on my briefcase open. The sharp sound echoed loudly in the silent room like a gun. David, the corporate litigator, stepped forward and placed a heavy stack of reports. It was the complete forensic audit Desmond had meticulously prepared for this day. Every single fake invoice and stolen dollar was documented in absolute devastating detail. Richard looked nervously down at the thick document on the table. The healthy color drained entirely from his face as he read the bold title, "Formal Declaration of Corporate Fraud and Embezzlement." His hands began to shake slightly against the wooden table. "What is this garbage?" Richard stammered weakly, pushing the document away. "I am absolutely not reading this completely fabricated nonsense. My accounting is completely flawless and legal. That is not garbage, Richard," I replied, leaning forward, folding my hands together. "That is a highly detailed map of your future federal prison cell." Chloe aggressively grabbed the conservatorship papers and waved them wildly in the air. "I do not care what fake papers you brought here," she screamed loudly. "You are a sick, highly paranoid old man. We are calling the state court right now. You are going straight to a locked nursing home today." The representative from Apex Horizon finally stepped forward toward the table. He simply placed a single sheet of official paper on top of Chloe's threat. "You are not calling anyone," he said in a completely cold professional tone. "I represent Apex Horizon, the primary senior debt holder for this entire commercial operation. We have thoroughly reviewed the recent financial disclosures and found massive criminal irregularities. Because of your complete failure to meet the third quarter payment obligations, you are officially in total breach of contract. As of this exact moment, Apex Horizon is seizing full operational control of all corporate assets immediately." Richard gasped heavily for air, exactly like a drowning man. Chloe dropped the threatening papers instantly, as if they had suddenly caught fire. Julian stared blindly at me in total shock. The boardroom massacre had officially begun. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. Richard stared at the single sheet of paper the representative from Apex Horizon had placed on the mahogany table. His eyes were wide and his mouth was slightly open. Chloe was frozen in her chair. Her face had lost all its arrogant color, turning a sickly shade of pale white. Julian looked back and forth between me and the corporate lawyers. He still did not understand what was happening. He still thought this was just a simple family disagreement. "What kind of sick joke is this?" Richard finally whispered, his voice cracking. He tried to push the piece of paper away, but his hands were shaking too violently. "You do not own anything here, Nathaniel. You are just a silent minority investor. You gave my son-in-law a $2 million equity gift to start this company. I built this place. We own the controlling shares. You have absolutely no legal standing to seize any assets." I looked at Richard with a deep sense of pity. He truly believed his own lies. He had run cheap construction scams for years and assumed the old black man from Chicago was just a walking bank. "I did not give Julian an equity gift, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I never give anything away for free. I am a businessman. When Julian came to me asking for $2 million, I did not just write a personal check and hand it over. I directed my wealth management firm to draft a very specific financial instrument." I nodded to David, my corporate litigator. David opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick bound contract. He slid it across the polished wooden table. It stopped right in front of Julian. "Look at the cover page." "Julian," I commanded softly. My son slowly reached out with trembling fingers. He opened the heavy cover. He stared at the bold black letters printed at the top of the very first page. He read the words out loud in a barely audible whisper. "Senior Secured Mezzanine Loan Agreement." "That is exactly right," I said, leaning forward slightly. $2 million was not equity. It was not a gift. It was a high-interest mezzanine loan secured directly against the total operating assets of this entire wellness resort. My holding company, Apex Horizon, provided the capital. In exchange, Apex Horizon holds the senior debt position. That means before you pay your construction teams, before you pay your vendors, and certainly before you pay yourselves, you must pay the monthly premium to Apex Horizon. Julian looked up at me with tears welling in his eyes. "But I do not remember signing a loan, Dad," he said, his voice breaking. "You told me it was the seed money. You told me you wanted me to build my own table." "I did want you to build your own table, Julian," I replied firmly. "But I also wanted to see if you were mature enough to read the blueprints. I handed you a 40-page legal contract. I specifically told you to have your own independent lawyer review it before you signed the final page. Did you do that, Julian? Did you read even a single page of the document that funded your entire fake empire?" Julian slowly lowered his head. A single tear rolled down his cheek and hit the mahogany table. "No," he whispered. "I just signed the last page. Chloe said we needed the money immediately to secure the construction permits. We were in a rush. You were in a rush to pretend you were wealthy," I corrected him. "You were in a rush to impress your new father-in-law, and because of your desperate laziness, you signed away the entire company." Chloe suddenly slammed her hands on the table. She jumped out of her chair, her eyes blazing with desperate fury. "This is illegal," she screamed loudly. "This is predatory lending. We will take you to court, Nathaniel. We will sue you for fraud. You tricked your own son into signing a loan he did not understand. A judge will throw this entire contract straight into the garbage." I did not even look at her. I kept my eyes locked on Richard, who was currently sweating through his expensive tailored suit. "There was no fraud, Chloe," I said. "Chloe, calmly, Julian is a legally competent adult acting as the chief executive officer of a commercial enterprise. He signed a standard commercial loan agreement, and for the first 2 months, everything was perfectly fine. The resort operating account made the required interest payments to Apex Horizon automatically. But then something very interesting happened last month. I turned my attention entirely to Chloe now. She froze under my cold gaze. Last month, Richard realized his construction company was going completely bankrupt. I explained, outlining the exact timeline. He needed a massive injection of cash to pay his back taxes and avoid federal prosecution. So he instructed you, Chloe, to divert the operational funds. You stopped paying the vendors, you stopped paying the subcontractors, and most importantly, you stopped paying the scheduled premium to Apex Horizon. That is a complete lie, Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table. We never missed a payment. We are completely solvent, David. The litigator pulled out another sheet of paper. It was a printed transcript of the recorded phone call I had with Chloe earlier this week. David cleared his throat and began to read the transcript out loud. Quote, Nathaniel, we have a problem. The third quarter payment is overdue. We need the next installment of $500,000 transferred today. Unquote. David placed the transcript gently on the table. He looked directly at Chloe. You admitted on a recorded line that the payment was overdue. Mrs. Sterling, but you were confused about who owed the money. You thought Nathaniel owed you the next installment. In reality, the wellness resort owed Apex Horizon the monthly loan premium. By failing to remit that payment, you triggered the automatic default clause written clearly in Section 4 of the mezzanine agreement. The reality of the situation finally crashed down heavily on Richard and Chloe. The arrogance completely evaporated, leaving behind only raw, terrifying panic. They had built massive, beautiful building using my money. They had bragged to all their wealthy friends about their grand success, but because they did not read the contract and because they diverted the funds to save Richard's sinking ship, they had essentially handed the entire property right back to me on a silver platter. What does all this mean? Julian finally asked, his voice completely hollow and defeated. The representative from Apex Horizon answered him without a shred of emotion. It means you are in total default. It means the loan is instantly accelerated and the entire principal balance is due immediately. Since this company does not have $2 million in liquid cash to satisfy the debt, Apex Horizon is legally exercising its right to assume total legal ownership of all assets, property, and business operations. Richard broke the heavy silence in the room with a sudden loud burst of laughter. It was a forced, desperate sound that echoed awkwardly against the expensive mahogany walls. He leaned back in his leather chair and clapped his hands together as if I had just told a highly amusing joke at a dinner party. You really had me going for a second there, Nathaniel. He chuckled, wiping a fake tear from his eye. I will admit you play a very good game of corporate chicken, but you are completely forgetting one massive detail in your little hostile takeover fantasy. This building is appraised at over $10 million, Richard stated proudly. We have built a state-of-the-art wellness resort. We have enough equity to cover your loan. I can call my private bankers and have this property refinanced by Tuesday morning. You do not hold all the cards, old man. Chloe seemed to suddenly regain her lost arrogance. She sat up straight and smoothed her designer dress. Exactly, she sneered. You thought you could trap us, but you exposed your own stupidity. We have a massive equity cushion and do not need your money anymore. We will buy you out and proceed with the conservatorship because you are a danger to yourself. I did not interrupt them. I let Richard enjoy his brief moment of imaginary victory. When you deal with arrogant parasites, you must let them feel powerful right before you crush them. I looked at the representative from Apex Horizon. He nodded and reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a dark blue folder with the official seal of the county recorder. He slid it across the table until it rested directly on top of Richard's folded hands. Richard stopped laughing. He looked down at the blue folder. What is this? He asked, his voice losing its confident edge. That is the actual reality of your situation, I said softly. When I ran my logistics empire in Chicago, I learned a very important lesson. The man who owns the building is never the man who holds the real power. The power belongs to the dirt. Richard slowly opened the blue folder. His eyes darted across the dense legal text. I watched his face closely. I watched as his eyes hit the third paragraph of the first page. I watched as the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. 6 months ago, when Julian brought me this proposal, I did my own independent research. I discovered that the land this beautiful resort sits on was not purchased by your construction company. You only secured a commercial ground lease from the original private owner. You built a $10 million structure on a piece of land that you do not own. You thought it was a smart way to save capital. It was actually a fatal mistake. Julian looked completely lost. "What does a ground lease mean, Dad?" he asked, his voice trembling with fear. "It means," I explained, keeping my eyes locked firmly on Richard, "that your father-in-law built a castle on rented dirt, and the man who owns the dirt can dictate whatever happens to the castle." Chloe grabbed the blue folder from her father's shaking hands. She tried to read the legal jargon but was too panicked. "What is he talking about, Dad?" she demanded. "Tell him he is lying. Tell him we own this place." Richard did not look at her. He could not look at her. He just stared blankly at the polished wooden table. "Let me translate it for you, Chloe," I said smoothly. 5 months ago, my holding company, Apex Horizon, approached the original owner of this land. We made him a very generous cash offer. We purchased the deed to the property outright. Apex Horizon is not just your senior debt holder. We are also your permanent landlord. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy. It was the crushing weight of absolute financial ruin settling over the room. "If you want to refinance the building, Richard, you need the written permission of the landowner. No commercial bank will give you a $10 million loan on a building that sits on hostile ground. You have absolutely no equity without my land. But that is not even the best part." I continued, allowing a cold smile to finally touch my face. "According to the strict terms of the commercial ground lease, any default on the senior mezzanine debt triggers an automatic forfeiture of the physical improvements. That means because you failed to make your loan payment, you have violated the lease. You do not own the bricks anymore, Richard. They belong to the dirt now, and I own the dirt." Richard clutched his chest, breathing heavily. His entire life of scamming had finally caught up to him. He overcharged his son-in-law. He stole my money to pay his debts. He tried to have me locked away in a mental institution. In return, I quietly and flawlessly stole his entire building right out from under his feet. "You planned this from the very beginning," Chloe whispered, tears of sheer panic finally spilling down her perfectly made-up face. "You set us up. You wanted us to fail." "I did not set you up, Chloe," I replied. "I gave you $2 million and an opportunity to build something real. You chose to steal from me. You chose to disrespect me. You tried to declare me mentally incompetent so you could steal everything I had left. I simply let you build your own trap. I just provided the rope." Julian buried his face in his hands and began to sob openly. It was the sound of a boy realizing he had traded his birthright for a fake crown. He had sided with the people, using him as a pawn, and now he was going down with their sinking ship. The representative from Apex Horizon stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. "As the legal owner of this property and all associated assets, I am formally demanding that you vacate the premises immediately," he stated in a crisp, professional tone. "We have private security teams waiting in the lobby. You have exactly 1 hour to gather your personal belongings. Any attempt to remove corporate documents, financial records, or physical assets will be treated as criminal theft and reported directly to the federal authorities." Richard tried to stand up, but his legs gave out. He collapsed back into his leather chair, a completely broken man. The arrogant real estate mogul was gone. He was nothing more than a cheap thief who had finally been caught by a much bigger predator. Chloe was weeping uncontrollably, her head resting on the mahogany table she no longer owned. I stood up and picked up my leather briefcase. I looked down at the three of them. I did not feel any joy. I did not feel any triumph. I just felt a quiet sense of restored order. The silent adjustment was complete, and I knew that my legacy was perfectly safe now from these greedy thieves. The heavy silence inside the mahogany boardroom was suddenly broken by the sound of Richard breathing. He was gasping for air like a fish thrown onto the dry deck of a boat. The sheer panic in his chest was visible through his expensive tailored suit. He looked at the blue folder containing the ground lease, and then he looked at me. His brain was desperately trying to calculate a way out of the massive steel trap that had just snapped shut around his ankles. He was a man who had spent his entire life slipping through the cracks of the legal system, but he had finally hit a solid brick wall. Chloe was completely frozen in her seat, staring blindly at the polished wood. Julian was quietly weeping in the corner, finally understanding the massive scale of the destruction he had invited into his life. Richard wiped a thick layer of cold sweat from his forehead. He forced a very weak and pathetic smile onto his pale face. He leaned forward and placed his shaking hands flat on the table. "Listen to me, Nathaniel," Richard said, his voice trembling violently. "Let us be reasonable about this situation. We are both businessmen. We both know how the real world works. There is absolutely no need to destroy this beautiful family venture over a simple misunderstanding regarding the loan structure. You have proven your point brilliantly. You are a very smart man. You outplayed me on the ground lease, and I respect that immensely. But you do not want the massive headache of running a luxury wellness resort. You are retired. You do not want to manage staff or deal with health inspectors. I can make this right for you today. I can offer you a very generous buyout. I will write you a check right now for $500,000 cash. You can walk away with a massive profit and we can keep the building. It is a win for everyone. I sat perfectly still and listened to him beg. He was offering me pennies on the dollar for my own money. He was offering me a fraction of the wealth he had stolen from me just to keep the illusion of his empire alive. He still thought I was an amateur who cared about his dirty cash. He still thought I was a poor old black man who would eagerly jump at the chance to hold $500,000. He completely failed to realize that I was not sitting in that boardroom to negotiate a financial settlement. I was sitting there to execute a total demolition. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and calm, "you still do not understand the game we are playing. You think this is a negotiation about real estate. You think I care about the ceramic tiles or the fake marble lobby. I built a multi-million-dollar logistics empire in Chicago before you even knew how to tie your own expensive leather shoes. I do not need your money. I do not need a buyout from a desperate thief who is drowning in his own bad debt. I did not come here today to take your money. I came here today to take your freedom." Richard stopped trying to force his pathetic smile. The color completely drained from his face again, leaving him looking like a sick old man. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. I nodded to David, my corporate litigator. David reached into his heavy briefcase one more time. He pulled out a thick red folder. It was significantly larger than the blue folder containing the ground lease. David placed the red folder gently on the table and slid it slowly across the polished wood. It stopped directly in front of Richard, right next to the blue folder. "Go ahead and open it, Richard," I instructed smoothly. "It is a very fascinating story. It is a story about a failing commercial construction company and a desperate man who decided to rob his own son-in-law to pay his back taxes." Richard stared at the red folder as if it were a live explosive device. His hand shook so badly he could barely grip the edge of the cardboard cover. He slowly flipped it open. The first page was a detailed executive summary prepared by Desmond, my forensic accountant. "While you were busy drinking expensive champagne at the country club and laughing at me, I hired a forensic accountant," I explained, my voice cutting through the silent room like a razor blade. "He spent the last 4 days completely tearing your fake empire apart. He found every single dollar you stole. He found the 3 dummy shell companies you registered in Delaware. He found the fake invoices you submitted for the environmental impact studies that never actually happened. He found the exact $50,000 wire transfer you used to buy your daughter a luxury car for her birthday, using the money meant for the commercial plumbing system. He tracked every single penny from my senior mezzanine loan straight into your personal offshore bank accounts." Chloe gasped loudly. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She looked at her father, begging him silently to deny the allegations. But Richard could not speak. He was hyperventilating his eyes, scanning the detailed bank records and wire transfer receipts neatly organized inside the red folder. The evidence was absolutely undeniable. It was a complete mathematical map of his criminal behavior. "This is totally inadmissible," Richard stammered weakly, wiping more sweat from his face. "You cannot just hack into my private financial records. This is a massive violation of my privacy. No judge will ever accept this stolen information in a civil court. I will have my lawyers bury you in privacy litigation for the next 10 years. You are still not listening to me, Richard," I said, leaning back in my chair and folding my hands. "This is not going to a civil court. I am not suing you for the stolen money. I do not want the money back. The money is completely irrelevant to me now." Richard looked up from the folder. His eyes were completely hollow and filled with pure, unfiltered terror. "Then what are you going to do with this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I am not going to do anything with it," I replied, allowing a cold and deeply satisfying smile to finally appear on my face. "I already did it. That red folder is just a courtesy copy for you to read while you wait. The original certified copies were securely delivered to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Regional Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation exactly 2 hours ago." The boardroom was instantly plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. The word federal hung heavily in the air like a thick, toxic cloud. Richard knew exactly what that meant. State courts deal with fines and civil settlements. Federal courts deal with mandatory prison sentences and total asset forfeiture. You committed massive wire fraud, Richard Furt explained slowly, ensuring he understood every single word. You committed felony tax evasion. You engaged in a highly documented conspiracy to commit grand larceny across state lines using the Delaware shell companies. The federal agents do not care about your country club memberships or your wealthy friends. They care about the paper trail, and the paper trail I handed them is absolutely perfect. They are probably drafting the federal arrest warrants for you and your daughter right now. Chloe let out a sharp, agonizing scream. She jumped up from her chair and backed away from the table as if it were on fire. "No," she cried out hysterically. "No, I did not do anything wrong. I just signed the papers my father gave me. I did not know it was stolen money. You cannot let them send me to prison, Nathaniel. I am your family. I am Julian's wife. Please, you have to call them and tell them it was all a big mistake." I looked at the woman who had publicly humiliated me just a few days ago. The woman who had threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward because I refused to fund her extravagant lifestyle. I felt absolutely nothing for her. "You are not my family, Chloe," I said coldly, "and you did know the money was stolen. You authorized the payments. You wore the diamond necklace bought with my money. You laughed in my face when I asked about the grand opening. You made your bed and now you are going to sleep in it for a very long time." Richard collapsed forward onto the mahogany table. He buried his face in his arms and began to weep uncontrollably. The great aristocratic real estate mogul was entirely destroyed. His fake empire had collapsed completely into dust. He had lost the building, he had lost the land, and now he had permanently lost his freedom. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison cell wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit instead of a bespoke tailored suit. I stood up slowly and buttoned my charcoal gray jacket. The boardroom massacre was finally over. The silent adjustment was complete. I looked down at the three broken people sitting in the room. They had tried to push an old black man into an early grave, but they ended up digging their own dark tombs. I picked up my leather briefcase and turned my back on them. I walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving the screaming and crying behind me forever. The air outside the boardroom suddenly felt incredibly clean and fresh. I walked down the long marble hallway with absolute dignity, knowing that justice is not something you passively wait for, but something you forcefully take. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom were closed, but the air inside was completely sucked out of the room. I remained in my leather chair. I had told them I was leaving, but I paused. I wanted to witness the final stage of the collapse. When you back a pack of starving wolves into a dark corner, they do not accept their fate with quiet dignity. They turn their sharp teeth on each other. Richard was the first to show his true animal nature. The terrifying reality of federal prison had completely stripped away his fake aristocratic charm. He wiped his sweating face with his expensive silk tie. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He slowly lifted his head and looked directly at my son. The look in his eyes was pure venomous survival. He was a drowning man looking for a body to stand on so he could catch one last breath of air. Julian, Richard said, his voice shaking but filled with a sudden dark malice. "You are the chief executive officer of this company. You are the one who signed every single quarterly financial report. You are the one who authorized the vendor payments. I am just an independent third-party contractor. I just submitted the invoices. If there was any financial mismanagement, it falls entirely on your shoulders. You were the one in charge of the operational ledger, Julian. You approved everything." Julian looked at his father-in-law with absolute disbelief. The young man who had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to win Richard's approval was suddenly hit by the brutal force of reality. "You told me to sign those papers," Julian stammered, his voice cracking with shock. "You told me the consulting fees were standard industry practice. You said the shell companies were just a normal tax strategy. You guided my hand through every single transaction. I trusted you, Richard. You are my family. Family does not mean anything in a federal indictment." "Julian," Richard spat back aggressively, "the federal investigators will look at the signatures. They will see your name on the bottom of the wire transfers. You cannot play the victim here. You were the head of the company. You had a fiduciary duty to manage the capital properly. I simply followed your directives. You are going to take the fall for this, Julian. I will hire the best criminal defense attorney in the state, and I will testify against you to secure a plea deal for myself." The mask had completely fallen off. The elite wealthy patriarch was nothing more than a cowardly rat willing to send his own son-in-law to a concrete prison cell to save his own miserable skin. Julian shrank back into his chair. The betrayal was so absolute and so profound that he could not even formulate a response. He finally understood that he was never part of their family. He was always just a convenient shield. He was the disposable asset they planned to burn when the fire eventually caught up to them. But Richard had made a massive tactical error. In his desperate rush to throw Julian under the bus, he had completely forgotten who actually processed the payments. Chloe suddenly stepped forward, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of betrayal and blinding rage. She grabbed the edge of the mahogany table. "Are you insane, Dad?" Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs. Her voice echoed violently against the glass walls. "Julian did not process those wire transfers. I did. I am the financial director. My name is on the bank authorizations. If you throw Julian to the federal agents, they are going to drag me right down with him. You used me to steal that money. You told me it was the only way to save our family estate. You told me nobody would ever find out." "Shut your mouth, Chloe!" Richard roared, his face turning a deep, violent shade of purple. "Do not say another word. You are admitting to a crime right in front of them. They already know everything." Chloe shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the red folder resting on the table. "The Federal Bureau already has the audit. My life is completely over because of you. I married this pathetic loser just so we could get access to his father's money. You promised me we would be rich. You promised me we would finally be able to pay off your massive debts and live like real aristocrats. Instead, you turned me into a federal criminal. I am going to lose my country club membership. I am going to lose my friends. I am going to a federal prison because you are a complete failure as a businessman and a complete failure as a father." The words hit Richard like a physical blow to the face. The illusion of their close-knit high society family was entirely shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. They had spent years pretending to be vastly superior to everyone else. They looked down on people like me. They judged my faded jeans and my old leather boots. They thought their white skin and their fake country club manners made them invincible. But underneath the expensive clothes and the imported champagne, they were absolutely nothing. They were just greedy, miserable parasites turning on each other the second the host cut off their food supply. "You spoiled, ungrateful little brat!" Richard hissed, stepping toward his own daughter with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "I gave you everything. I bought you cars and jewelry. I paid for your luxurious lifestyle while my own company was slowly bleeding to death. You gladly spent the stolen money, Chloe. You did not ask any ethical questions when you bought that diamond necklace. You did not feel any guilt when you hosted that massive grand opening party. You are just as guilty as I am. If I am going down, I am taking you right down with me. You will not survive a single week in a prison cell." Chloe completely lost her mind. She lunged forward and grabbed the thick red folder containing the forensic audit. She threw it directly at her father's face. The folder hit his chest and the heavy pages scattered all over the polished wooden floor. "You ruined my life!" she sobbed hysterically, sinking to her knees amidst the scattered evidence of their crimes. "You ruined everything. I hate you. I wish you were dead." I sat back and just watched the magnificent destruction unfolding silently before me. I did not say a single word. I had orchestrated this complete bloodbath using nothing more than ink and paper. I simply used their own toxic greed to build a bomb and locked them inside a room with it. Julian sat in the corner weeping quietly. He watched his beautiful, perfect wife scream vicious curses at her wealthy, perfect father. The fake elite world he sacrificed his own flesh and blood to desperately join was completely burning down right before his very eyes. My silent adjustment was finally perfectly and entirely complete forever. The screaming inside the boardroom finally died down. The echo of Chloe's hysterical sobbing was the only sound left, bouncing off the expensive mahogany walls. Richard was still on the floor, scrambling to gather the scattered pages of the forensic audit, as if hiding the paper would somehow make the federal charges disappear. I stood by the door, watching them with absolute emotional detachment. The representative from Apex Horizon checked his heavy silver wristwatch. He looked at me and gave a very small nod. The 1-hour grace period was officially over. It was time to clean the house completely. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small black radio. "Send the team inside right now," he instructed calmly. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy oak doors swung wide open. 4 massive men walked into the room. They were not the cheap, untrained security guards Richard had hired to stand around the lobby. These men were elite private contractors wearing sharp black suits and carrying themselves with strict military discipline. They were now directly under my personal payroll through the holding company. Their faces were completely devoid of any sympathy or any hesitation at all. The lead security officer stepped directly toward Richard, who was still kneeling on the expensive rug. "Sir, you need to vacate the premises immediately," the officer stated. His voice left absolutely no room for debate. Richard looked up, his face completely pale. "You cannot do this to me," Richard stammered, trying to regain some fraction of his lost authority. "I am a respected business owner. I built this entire resort with my own bare hands." The officer did not blink. He simply reached down, grabbed Richard by the upper arm, and pulled him to his feet effortlessly like a doll. Chloe backed away until she hit the glass wall. "Do not touch me," she hissed as another guard approached her. "I will walk out on my own. Just give me 5 minutes to pack my office." The representative from Apex Horizon shook his head slowly. "You have no office here anymore," he said coldly. "Everything inside that room, including your computer and your files, is now the legal property of the holding company. You will leave exactly as you are right now." Chloe looked down at her empty, shaking hands. She had absolutely nothing left to her name today. Nothing. Julian stood up from his corner chair looking completely shattered. He took a step toward me but stopped when he saw the cold, blank expression on my face. I did not offer him any comfort. He needed to feel the intense, burning sting of his own foolish choices. The guards motioned for them to walk toward the door. Richard stumbled slightly, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the floor. Chloe followed right behind him, keeping her head lowered in deep shame. The grand exit was about to begin. They were forced out of the quiet boardroom and pushed forward. The executive hallway was usually very quiet, but the loud commotion had drawn attention. Several administrative assistants and junior managers had stepped out of their offices to see what was happening. These were the same employees that Chloe had treated like absolute garbage for the past 10 weeks. She had yelled at them constantly over minor trivial details. Now those same employees stood silently watching their arrogant boss being frog-marched down the corridor by large security guards. Nobody looked sad. Nobody offered to help her. They just watched her massive public downfall with quiet, extreme, deeply hidden, satisfying pleasure. Richard tried to cover his face with his hands as they passed the glass windows of the spa sector. He had spent months parading around this building, acting like a visionary genius who designed everything from scratch. Now he looked exactly like what he truly was, a pathetic, desperate common thief caught red-handed. The guards did not let them use the private rear exit. I had given strict orders to the team leader. They were going to take the longest possible route straight through the very center of the bustling main luxury reception lobby area for everyone to see. The main lobby was completely packed with wealthy afternoon clients. The high society friends that Chloe loved to impress were lounging on the expensive sofas, drinking herbal teas and waiting for their luxury massages. When the heavy corridor doors opened, the wealthy patrons turned their heads to look. The sight was absolutely shocking to them. Richard Sterling, the fake real estate mogul, was being physically escorted by 2 large, intimidating security men. His expensive tailored suit was wrinkled and his face was dripping with a thick layer of cold sweat. The entire room felt completely dead and utterly, totally silent. Chloe walked right behind him, trying desperately to hide her tear-stained face behind her blonde hair. But it was completely useless. One of the wealthy women sitting near the front desk stood up in absolute shock. Chloe, the woman, asked loudly, "What on earth is going on here? Are you being arrested today?" Chloe let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. She could not even form a single coherent sentence to defend herself. The woman who had bragged endlessly about her supreme exclusive ownership was now being thrown out like common street trash before the eyes of her peers today. Richard tried to pull his arm away from the guard. "Take your hands off me," Richard barked weakly. "I am leaving voluntarily." The guard ignored his command entirely. He maintained his iron grip and kept pushing Richard forward toward the large glass sliding doors. The entire lobby was buzzing with furious whispers. Cell phones were already coming out of expensive designer purses. People were taking pictures and recording videos of the great Richard Sterling being evicted from his own fake palace. The absolute total humiliation was recorded forever in high-definition digital memory for the whole wide world to see. They were finally pushed through the automatic sliding glass doors and out into the bright, hot afternoon sun. The guards released them on the concrete pavement right next to the main driveway. "Do not ever return to this property," the lead guard stated in a booming voice. If you step foot on this land again, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing. Richard stood on the curb, breathing heavily. He looked back at the magnificent building he thought he had completely stolen from me. He had absolutely nothing left now. His car keys were still inside the locked office upstairs. Chloe sank down onto the hard concrete curb, completely ruining her expensive white linen dress. She wrapped her arms around her knees and continued to sob loudly. There was no elegant country club brunch waiting for her today. There was only the harsh, brutal reality of the cold street. I walked slowly out of the boardroom and made my way to the front windows. I looked through the glass and watched them sitting there on the hot pavement. My money had bought the building, but my perfect patience had finally bought me true, ultimate, deeply satisfying, sweet, peaceful, lasting justice. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving the boardroom completely empty except for my son and me. The loud, chaotic energy of the eviction had entirely faded away into a cold, dead silence. Julian stood alone near the far end of the long mahogany table. He looked completely shattered. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled and his shoulders were slumped forward in absolute defeat. He stared blindly at the empty leather chair where his fake aristocratic father-in-law had been sitting just a few minutes ago. The illusion of his perfect wealthy life had completely evaporated into thin air. I did not speak to him right away. I let the heavy silence do the work. Silence forces a man to look directly into the mirror of his own absolute failures. Julian slowly raised his head and looked at the expensive glass walls of the room. He finally understood that none of this belonged to him. He had traded his birthright for a cheap imitation of high society. He had allowed his arrogant white in-laws to use him as a convenient shield to steal his own inheritance. He was never their true equal partner in this massive commercial venture. He was only their key to my bank account. When the vault finally locked, they threw him away without a single second thought. Julian slowly turned his body to face me. His eyes were completely red and swollen from crying. The arrogant young executive was completely gone now. He was just a lost little boy who had touched a hot stove and burned his hand to the bone. He took a hesitant step toward me. His hands were shaking violently at his sides. He slowly opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, broken sob came out initially today. "Dad," he finally whispered quietly, his voice echoing weakly across the massive empty room. "I am so sorry, Dad. I was so incredibly stupid. I just wanted them to like me. I wanted to be part of their world. Chloe always made me feel like our family was not sophisticated enough. I wanted to prove that I could sit at their elite table and be just as successful as Richard. I did not know he was stealing the money. I swear to God, Dad, I did not know about the fake invoices or the offshore shell companies he created secretly. I just signed the papers because Chloe told me it was the right thing to do." Julian continued to sob openly while confessing his absolute ignorance. "I traded everything you built for a complete lie. I let them disrespect you in your own house. I let them threaten to lock you away in a mental institution. I was too weak to stand up to them. I am a complete failure, Dad. I lost my wife and my company in a single afternoon. Please forgive me now, Dad. Please give me one more chance to make things right for our family." He took 2 more quick steps toward me and completely opened his arms. He was expecting the warm, comforting embrace of a forgiving father. He expected me to wrap my arms around his shaking shoulders and tell him that everything was going to be perfectly fine. He thought my parental love would instantly erase the massive consequences of his complete betrayal. He thought the $2 million and the legal conservatorship papers were just water under the bridge now that he was finally sorry. He immediately stepped into my personal space, expecting a hug to instantly heal his broken world. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still with my arms resting calmly at my sides. I looked directly into his desperate, crying eyes. My face remained an absolute mask of cold, unyielding stone. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. His open arms slowly dropped back down to his sides. The heavy, crushing realization hit him incredibly hard. He finally saw that the unconditional safety net he had relied on his entire life was completely gone. I was no longer the soft, forgiving father who would blindly clean up his massive, terrible messes without any strict conditions. "Apologies do not rebuild a burned house, Julian." I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any soft emotion. "You did not just make a minor business mistake. You actively participated in my planned execution. You sat in that chair and watched your wife hand me legal papers that would have stripped away my basic human freedom. You were perfectly willing to let me die in a locked nursing home just so you could keep playing pretend with your fake aristocratic friends. That dark kind of profound absolute betrayal cannot be magically erased with a few pathetic crying tears. Your mother and I worked our fingers to the bone on the freezing docks of Chicago. I continued stepping closer to him until he was forced to look down at the floor. We bled for every single dollar we earned. We faced down violent men and corrupt politicians so you would never have to know what true poverty feels like. But we made a massive mistake, Julian. We made your life too incredibly easy. We gave you the heavy crown without ever making you carry the heavy stones to build the castle. You have absolutely no respect for hard work. I turned around and walked out of the massive oak doors, leaving him standing alone in the boardroom once again. I walked down the long, silent executive hallway. I stopped in front of a small wooden door marked for the janitorial staff. I opened the door and stepped into the cramped, dark supply closet. I reached past the expensive cleaning chemicals and grabbed a heavy industrial mop. I grabbed a large yellow plastic bucket. I carried these two simple, heavy items back down the long hallway toward the executive boardroom where my broken son was still crying and patiently waiting. I walked directly back into the room and dropped the heavy, wet mop directly at his expensive leather shoes. I dropped the yellow bucket right next to it. The plastic handle rattled loudly against the polished mahogany floor. Julian stared down at the cleaning supplies in total, absolute confusion. He looked back up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "What is this, Dad?" he asked, his voice trembling with a fresh wave of deep panic. "This is your second chance, Julian," I replied coldly, pointing a single finger down at the dirty mop resting on the expensive hardwood floor today. "You are no longer the chief executive officer of this resort," I stated with absolute finality. "You do not get a corner office and you do not wear expensive suits anymore. If you want to remain on this property, you will work as a janitor. You will clean the toilets and scrub the floors for minimum wage. You will learn the actual value of a single dollar by breaking your back to earn it. You will start at the very bottom just like I did. Pick up the mop, Julian. Pick it up right now or leave my building forever." The very next morning, I walked through the massive glass doors of the resort, not as a silent investor, but as the absolute sole owner. The air inside still smelled of expensive eucalyptus and the lingering stench of false arrogance. I knew the first thing I had to do was completely strip away the toxic culture that Chloe and Richard had carefully built. They had designed this entire place to be an exclusive playground for the wealthy white elite. They cared entirely about vanity, social status, and cheap optical illusions. I cared only about authentic value and incredibly solid foundations. I immediately fired the entire executive board that Richard had personally installed during his brief corrupt reign. I did not give them any severance packages. I gave them exactly 1 hour to pack their expensive briefcases and leave my property. The staff Chloe had hired was a complete disaster of epic proportions. She had employed her arrogant country club friends to serve as highly paid consultants and wellness directors. They possessed absolutely no actual qualifications or practical experience. They simply walked around the resort drinking expensive herbal teas and judging the paying customers. I terminated every single one of them before noon. I gathered the remaining ground staff, the housekeepers, the cooks, and the maintenance workers in the main lobby. These were the people Chloe had treated like absolute garbage. These were the people who actually did the hard physical labor to keep the massive building running smoothly. I stood in front of them and completely restructured their entire compensation plan. I raised their hourly wages significantly and offered them full health benefits. I told them that from now on, hard work would be genuinely respected and properly rewarded. I brought in a completely new management team from my own trusted network in Chicago. I hired a brilliant black woman named Sarah to be the new general manager. She did not have a wealthy father or a fake aristocratic pedigree. She had a master's degree in hospitality and 15 years of brutal hands-on experience running massive commercial hotels. She was incredibly sharp, highly efficient, and completely immune to the fake charm of high society elites. Sarah immediately understood my exact vision for the property. We were going to completely rebrand the entire wellness resort. We stripped away the pretentious name Chloe had chosen and renamed the property the Vivian Estate. We fundamentally changed the core business model of the entire operation. Chloe and Richard had focused solely on selling overpriced memberships to people who just wanted to show off their wealth on social media. We shifted the focus to genuine holistic health and actual physical recovery. We partnered with local physical therapists and medical professionals. We opened our doors to people recovering from serious sports injuries and intensive surgeries. We replaced the ridiculous imported ceramic tiles with high-quality local materials. We stopped serving the overpriced imported champagne and started serving incredibly healthy organic meals sourced directly from local minority-owned farms. The resort stopped being a fake country club and quickly transformed into a legitimate, highly respected wellness institution. The wealthy elite friends of Chloe completely stopped coming to the resort. They were absolutely horrified that the exclusive gates had been opened to regular, hardworking people. I did not miss them at all. They were exactly the kind of toxic parasites I wanted to permanently flush out of my new business. Within just 3 short months, the Vivian estate was completely fully booked. We were generating massive legitimate profits because we were offering a genuinely superior service. People recognized the absolute quality and the undeniable authenticity of our new operation. Every single afternoon, I took a long, quiet walk around the beautiful, sprawling grounds of the resort. I watched the new guests walking through the gardens and swimming in the massive heated pools. The atmosphere was no longer tense and judgmental. It was incredibly peaceful and deeply healing. I often saw my son Julian during these daily walks. He was wearing a simple gray maintenance uniform, pushing a heavy cleaning cart down the long outdoor pathways. He did not look up when I walked past him. He kept his head down and focused entirely on scrubbing the stone walkways. It was a very harsh punishment, but it was the only way to save his corrupted soul. He was finally learning the true, heavy weight of an honest day's labor. During these quiet afternoon walks, my mind always wandered back to Vivian. I thought about the tiny freezing apartment we shared in Chicago when we were young and incredibly hungry. I remembered how she would carefully count every single penny we earned from my very first delivery truck. She never asked for expensive diamond necklaces or luxury cars. She only asked for loyalty, respect, and a safe home for our family. We built our massive wealth together brick by brick through decades of absolute sheer determination and endless grueling sacrifice. When Vivian passed away, I promised her that I would always protect our legacy. I promised her that I would ensure our hard-earned wealth would never be squandered by foolishness or stolen by greedy wolves. Standing in the boardroom a few weeks ago and watching Richard try to steal everything we had built was the ultimate test of that sacred promise I had felt. Vivian's calm, steady spirit standing right beside me when I dropped that ground lease folder onto the mahogany table. She was the one who taught me how to be incredibly patient. She was the one who taught me that true power never needs to shout. I sat down on a wooden bench near the edge of the large, peaceful lake located at the back of the resort property. The warm southern breeze gently rustled the leaves of the large oak trees. I watched a small flock of birds glide smoothly across the surface of the perfectly calm water. I felt a profound sense of absolute closure settling deep into my aging bones today. The war was officially over, and I had emerged completely victorious. I had successfully defended the walls of my fortress against the invaders who tried to destroy me from the inside. I did not just save my financial assets, I saved the fundamental dignity of my family name. Richard and Chloe thought they could easily manipulate an old black man because they believed they were inherently superior. They believed their fake class and their stolen money made them untouchable. But I had completely dismantled their entire pathetic universe, using nothing but the very laws they thought they could manipulate. I had exposed their lies, stripped away their stolen wealth, and handed them directly over to the federal authorities. As the sun slowly began to set over the Vivian estate, I took a deep, long breath of the fresh, clean air. The heavy burden I had been carrying for the past year was finally completely gone. The resort was thriving under Sarah's brilliant leadership. The local community was greatly benefiting from our new, inclusive business model. And my beloved wife Vivian was finally being properly honored every single day by the beautiful, healing sanctuary that now proudly carried her beautiful name. I closed my eyes and smiled softly to myself. The ashes of the massive fire had completely settled, and the strong new foundation was finally perfectly solid forever. Now I could rest, knowing that justice was done. I had proven to everyone that a quiet older man who observes carefully holds more power than any loud, arrogant thief. The wolves were locked away securely in their cages. The fortress was safe. The legacy of true wealth built on authentic character had survived the storm completely intact and entirely victorious and pure. 6 months have passed since the heavy oak doors of the boardroom closed on the fake aristocratic empire. I am standing on the top balcony of the main building of the Vivian estate. The morning air is crisp and cool against my face. I am holding a simple ceramic mug filled with dark black coffee. I do not add sugar or cream. I like the bitter taste because it reminds me of the hard truth of reality. The resort below me is quiet, but it is a different kind of quiet now. It is no longer the tense, arrogant silence of people pretending to be better than everyone else. It is the peaceful quiet of a well-run machine. The gardens are perfectly manicured and the healing pools are crystal clear. The massive financial bleeding has been stopped and the property is turning a profit. I take a slow sip of my coffee and look out over the sprawling green lawns. Justice is a strange thing. When you finally achieve it, you never feel sudden wild joy. You just feel a settling weight drop away from your shoulders. Richard Sterling is no longer wearing bespoke tailored suits or drinking imported champagne. 2 months after the boardroom massacre, the federal jury handed down a massive 50-count indictment against him. The federal investigators used the red folder of forensic evidence to dismantle his corrupt life. They seized his leased luxury vehicles. They seized his heavily mortgaged country estate. They froze every offshore bank account he had tried to hide his stolen money inside. He thought he could outsmart the federal prosecutors by offering to testify against his own daughter and my son. But the investigators did not need his pathetic testimony. The paper trail was perfect. Richard is currently sitting in a secure federal detention center, waiting for his official criminal trial to begin. He is wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit and eating terrible prison food off a cheap plastic tray. He has been denied bail because the judge deemed him a massive flight risk. The wealthy friends he used to play golf with do not visit him. They do not send him letters. They have erased his name from their high society circles. He is alone, locked in a concrete cell, with nothing but the memory of his greed. Chloe experienced a brutal fall from her fake aristocratic pedestal. When the holding company seized the resort assets, we legally froze her corporate accounts and revoked her fraudulent salary. Because her father was federally indicted, their family credit lines were destroyed overnight. The luxury car she bought with my stolen money was repossessed from the parking lot of her apartment complex. She was forced to face the harsh reality of the real world without stolen money to protect her. Chloe works at a retail clothing store inside a crowded local shopping mall. She stands on her feet for 8 hours a day, folding cheap cotton shirts and dealing with rude customers. She earns the legal minimum wage. She takes the bus to work every morning because she can no longer afford a personal vehicle. The wealthy women she used to drink expensive mimosas with stopped answering her phone calls. When they see her working at the mall, they turn their heads and walk in the opposite direction. She is learning the painful lesson that her elite status was fake. Her value was tied to the stolen money she threw around. Now that the money is gone, she is invisible to the world she desperately worshipped. I look straight down from my high balcony and see a young man pushing a metal wheelbarrow across the damp morning grass. He is wearing thick work gloves and a simple gray maintenance uniform. His boots are covered in wet mud. It is my son, Julian. He has been working as a groundskeeper for the past 6 months. He arrives at the property every morning before the sun comes up. He pulls weeds, he plants heavy bushes, and he scrubs the stone pathways until his hands are blistered and raw. I did not give him any special treatment. He clocks in and he clocks out just like every other manual laborer on the payroll. He earns exactly the same minimum wage as the rest of the entry-level maintenance staff. He rents a small cheap apartment on the wrong side of the city and he pays for his groceries using the small paycheck he earns with his own physical sweat. At first, the physical labor destroyed him. He would go home every night with an aching back and exhausted muscles. He wanted to quit 100 different times during that first brutal month, but he did not quit. He kept showing up every morning. Slowly over the past few months, I have watched a profound change take place inside of him. The soft, weak arrogance he learned from his fake aristocratic wife has been burned away by the hot afternoon sun. His shoulders are broader and his hands are rough and calloused. He no longer walks with the false swagger of a fake executive. He walks with the quiet, solid dignity of a man who finally understands the true value of an honest dollar. He does not ask me for money anymore. He does not ask for a promotion. He simply puts his head down and does the hard, dirty work that is required to keep this property beautiful. I watch Julian stop the heavy wheelbarrow near a large bed of yellow flowers. He takes off his thick leather gloves and wipes the sweat from his forehead. He looks up at the main building and sees me standing on the top balcony. For a long moment, we just look at each other across the wide open distance. He does not wave or smile. He just gives me a small, respectful nod. It is the kind of nod one working man gives to another. I slowly nod back at him. He puts his leather gloves back on, grabs the wooden handles of the wheelbarrow, and goes back to his hard physical labor. That simple, silent exchange is worth more to me than any massive portfolio. My son is waking up from his long, toxic dream. He is finally learning how to build his own table using his own two hands instead of trying to steal a seat at someone else's fake table. I turn away from the heavy wooden railing and walk slowly back toward the glass doors of my private office. The terrible storm that threatened to destroy my family legacy has passed. The greedy wolves have been banished to their cold, lonely cages, and the weak forced to grow strong. I set my ceramic mug down on my oak desk. I pull out my financial ledgers and begin to review the daily operational reports for the Vivian estate. Everything is perfectly organized. Everything is legitimate. I spent my entire life fighting brutal battles so I could build a safe fortress for my family. Now I finally know that the fortress is absolutely secure. The silent adjustment is finished and peace has been permanently restored. The passing of the seasons brings a different kind of clarity. I spend my quiet evenings sitting on the back porch of my home in Atlanta. This is the same home Julian and his fake aristocratic wife thought I was too old and foolish to maintain. The silence in my house is no longer a heavy burden. It is a profound and beautiful, peaceful sanctuary. I do not have to worry about the plotting of false family members anymore. The toxic weight has been completely lifted from my shoulders forever. The wellness resort continues to flourish under Sarah's brilliant and capable leadership. It has become a beacon of genuine health and community strength. But a building is just a building. A true lasting legacy is built in the minds and the hearts of the next generation. I finally realized that the $2 million I gave to Julian was a terrible mistake because it was unearned. I handed a massive fortune to a boy who did not know how to suffer or fight for his own dreams. I decided I would never make that mistake again. I contacted Marcus, my senior wealth manager, and instructed him to establish the Vivian Educational Trust. I fully funded the trust with $5 million directly from my accounts. We created a comprehensive scholarship and grant program specifically designed for young minority entrepreneurs. I wanted to find the young men and women growing up in places exactly like the freezing streets of Chicago or the tough, neglected neighborhoods of Atlanta. I wanted to find the hardworking kids who have the brilliant, bright fire of pure ambition in their eyes, but completely lack the financial capital to build their own tables. Every single month, I sit down in my quiet study and review the grant applications. I read the stories of young black and brown kids who want to start logistics, companies, technology firms, and community health clinics. They do not want free handouts to buy luxury cars or expensive country club memberships to impress people who hate them. They want seed money to buy their first delivery truck or to rent their first small commercial office space to build a real future. When I read their passionate essays, I see the same hungry reflection I had in the mirror 40 years ago. Funding their massive dreams brings me a level of profound, deep satisfaction that I have never felt before. I am finally planting strong seeds in incredibly fertile soil instead of pouring fresh water onto dead, toxic branches. Julian visits me once a month now. He takes the public bus from his small, cheap apartment to my house. He sits on my porch and drinks hot black coffee with me. He looks tired from the long hours of manual labor, but his eyes are finally clear. We do not talk about the massive fortune he lost, or the fake aristocratic wife who abandoned him the second the stolen money completely disappeared. We talk about the very simple things in life. We talk about the hard physical work he is doing at the resort every single day. We talk about the changing weather and the beautiful old memories of his late mother, Vivian. He is slowly learning how to be a real strong man. It is a very painful and incredibly slow process, but I finally have genuine hope for his future again. I had to completely break his world in order to save his actual living soul. It was the absolute hardest thing a loving father could ever do, but it was the only legitimate way to truly save his life from total destruction. The dark storm is completely over now. The wide sky is incredibly clear, and the future of my family legacy is finally perfectly secure. What did this ordeal teach me? I learned that money can buy a building, but it cannot buy loyalty, and it certainly cannot buy class. The greatest mistake you can make as a parent is mistaking your child's entitlement for ambition. I spent my life building a table so my son could sit and eat, only to watch him invite thieves to steal the plates. Kindness without boundaries is simply a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. Let them underestimate you. Let them think your silence is weakness. Because when the time comes, a true chess player does not flip the board, they simply own the ground the board sits on. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you found value in this lesson, please let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so I can continue sharing more powerful life stories with you. See you in the next video. Ciao.